Tobias Mercer only wanted to buy a skinny mare and return alone to his ranch on the borders of Grey Hollow. But instead, he ended up taking home a deaf orc girl sold by her own drunken father, and only a few days later, she saved his life seconds before tragedy struck, making Tobias realize that Isara was different because she could sense things no one else could hear. The sun was dying over Grey Hollow when Tobias Mercer first saw her. Not the girl, not yet. He saw the rope first. A frayed length of cord tied around a young woman's wrist, held by a hand that shook from drink rather than age. The cord was the kind used to lead goats to slaughter. The man holding it didn't seem to notice the difference. Tobias had come to the Grey Hollow Rural Fair for one reason only. A thin mare listed in the livestock ledger, third pen on the left, price reasonable enough for a man who counted every coin twice before spending one. He didn't come for conversation. He never did. He paid his taxes in town, bought his supplies at the edge of the market, and returned to his land before anyone could remember his name. 34 years of living had taught him that people asked questions he didn't want to answer. The fair was winding down under the dry heat of the frontier plains. 80 years after the Iron Treaty had ended the war between humans and orcs, both races traded side by side across the mud-packed square. Cattle, leather, iron tools, smoked meat, grain sacks and dried herbs changed hands with the casual indifference of a peace that had grown comfortable, if not entirely warm. Children of both races ran between the stalls. Old men of both races argued prices with equal stubbornness. Tobias moved through it all like water around stone. He was almost at the mare's pen when the sound reached him. Not a cry, nothing so dramatic, just a laugh, the sharp, cutting kind that men use when they want an audience. He turned his head once, the way a man does when he doesn't want to look but can't quite stop himself. The orc holding the rope was heavy-set, his green skin blotched and dull from years of poor living. He swayed slightly on his feet. His name, Tobias would later learn, was Brogar. But in that moment he was just a drunk man making a spectacle of something that wasn't his to display. Behind him stood the girl. She was young, 20, perhaps less. Her skin was the color of olive leaves in late summer, soft and deep all at once. Her eyes were amber, the shade of honey held up to firelight. Her ears curved to slight points beneath long, dark hair that hung loose and tangled. Her dress was held together with improvised cord at the shoulders. Her feet were bare on the hot, cracked earth. She was not crying. That was the thing Tobias noticed most. Every instinct told him a person in that position should be crumbling, should be looking for escape or help, or at minimum casting her eyes down to the dirt. Instead, she stood with a stillness that didn't come from resignation. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. Brogar was talking loudly now, gesturing at the girl with the theatrical boredom of a man who had told the same story too many times. "Born broken," he announced to no one and everyone. "Doesn't talk, doesn't hear. Not like a real orc woman." Some of the men nearby laughed. Others looked away, suddenly occupied with the grain sacks in front of them. Tobias looked at the mare in the pen, brown eyes, ribs visible, one foreleg slightly favored. She needed better feed and a month of rest. He could give her both. He reached for his coin purse. And then the girl looked at him, not desperately, not pleadingly. She simply looked at him with those amber eyes, the way the prairie looked at the horizon. Steady, patient, waiting for nothing in particular and somehow expecting everything. Tobias did not look away. He didn't know it yet, but he had already made his decision. Brogar made the offer before Tobias could open his mouth. "Take the mare and take the girl," the drunk orc said, pulling the rope slightly tighter around her wrist, as if to demonstrate she was included in the inventory. "She doesn't eat much, doesn't argue, won't even bother you with complaints." He grinned at his own cruelty. "Can't." Tobias stood very still. Around him, he could feel the attention of nearby fairgoers shifting. the way attention always shifts when something uncomfortable is about to become someone else's problem. A few men leaned closer. A woman pretended to examine a bolt of cloth 3 stalls away while keeping one ear turned toward the scene. "She's not fit for a tavern," Brogar continued, his voice climbing with alcohol-loosened pride. "Not fit for orc company, not fit for anything useful." He shrugged. "But maybe a farmer needs something to sweep the floors." The laughter came again, looser this time, easier. Tobias looked at the rope. He had a rule. He kept it simple. Don't get involved in other people's business. The frontier was full of hard situations and harder people. A man who spent his energy on every injustice he passed would have nothing left for the land he needed to work, the animals he needed to feed, the quiet life he had spent years building at the edge of everything. He looked at the girl again. She hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to her father's words. He couldn't tell if she truly hadn't heard them, or if she simply refused to let them reach her. Her eyes were still on him, not searching, not begging, just present, like a door left open on a still morning. Something moved in his chest that he hadn't expected. It wasn't pity. He'd felt pity before and knew its shape. It was softer than pity and sharper at the same time. It felt like recognition. He handed over the coins for the mare. Then he reached into his coat pocket and counted out a second amount. He didn't negotiate. He didn't ask questions about history or health, or what papers might or might not exist for a transaction like this. The frontier had its own paperwork, and most of it was just the word of the men involved. Brogar took the money faster than Tobias had expected. A man behind him made a joke about warming a cold house. Another added something about the rancher and his new orc company that drew snickers from the cluster nearby. Tobias didn't respond. He turned toward the girl. She stood watching him, the rope still in her father's hand. Brogar yanked it once, theatrically, as if to walk her forward like livestock toward a new pen. Tobias reached out and took the rope from him. Not violently, just firmly. The way a man picks up something that has been dropped carelessly and doesn't belong on the ground. Then he pulled a small knife from his belt and cut the cord above her wrist. He handed the severed end back to Brogar, not as a gesture, just because it wasn't his to keep. The girl looked down at her wrist where the rope had been. The skin was reddened beneath. She rubbed it once, slowly, with the fingers of her other hand. Then she looked up at Tobias. He expected something, gratitude or confusion or the start of fear. Any of the things a person shows when their situation suddenly changes without warning. What he got instead was a stillness even deeper than before, as if something that had been held tight inside her had simply quietly released. He turned toward the wagon without a word. After a moment, he heard the soft crunch of bare feet on dry earth behind him. She followed without being asked. He didn't know why that made the walk easier, but it did. She wrote her name near the kitchen door that first evening. Tobias had tried to explain the house using gestures and pointing, the wood stove, the water barrel, the shelf with the tin plates. He spoke aloud out of habit before catching himself each time, which made the whole attempt feel clumsy and slow. He was not a man who communicated well even under ordinary circumstances. Doing it without words made him feel like a person trying to describe color to someone who had never seen light. The girl watched all of it with calm attention. Before he could finish showing her the cupboard with the dried stores, she had already located the tinderbox, started the fire, found the water ladle, and set a pot on the heat. She moved through the kitchen the way water moves through familiar ground, not hurried, not hesitant, simply certain. Tobias stood back and watched. He went to the small table and placed a piece of chalk he'd used for marking fence posts. He pointed to it, then to her, then to the back of the door where the wood was darkest. She understood immediately. She crouched close to the floor, pressed the chalk carefully against the wood, and wrote one word in small, deliberate letters. Ysara. He said it aloud once. The sound felt strange in the quiet kitchen, like speaking in a room where no one had spoken for a long time. She didn't look up from the letters, but something in her shoulders shifted slightly, as if hearing her own name recognized had touched something she'd stopped expecting. That night, he gave her the small room off the back of the main cabin. It had a cot, a wool blanket, and a window that looked out over the eastern fields. He left a candle in the holder near the bed and didn't say anything else. He lay awake for a long time after. The ranch had been silent for years. Not the comfortable silence of a man at peace, but the specific silence of a place too empty for the size it occupied, the kind that sat in corners and collected like dust. He had grown used to it without ever growing fond of it. Tonight the silence was different. He could hear the fire settling in the stove, the horses shifting in the stable, small sounds that had always been there but had somehow blurred into nothing when there was no one else to make them real. He thought about the rope, about the way Brogar had held it, about the way she had stood. He'd seen animals sold at fairs before. He'd never felt like this afterward. The next morning she was already in the stable when he arrived to begin the day's work. She had risen before him in the cold grey hour before full light, found the injured mare in her stall, and was cleaning the animal's wounds with a cloth soaked in water from the trough. Her movements were slow and deliberate. The mare, who had arrived skittish and uncertain, stood completely calm beneath her hands. Tobias watched from the stable door for a moment before stepping inside. Isara didn't startle. She simply glanced up, acknowledged him with the smallest dip of her chin, and returned to what she was doing. He began feeding the other horses. They worked side by side in the pale morning light, without any words between them. The routine of the stable was simple and physical and required nothing that language could improve. The horses didn't care about the silence. The straw didn't need explanations. The water buckets were filled and the feed distributed, and the work was done. By the time they walked back to the cabin for breakfast, the sun had lifted over the eastern ridge and turned the red earth of the fields into something almost warm. Tobias noticed she had left a small piece of chalk on the kitchen windowsill. She had written something in tiny letters on the ledge beside it. Storm coming, north. He looked at the clear sky above the hills, not a cloud anywhere. By evening, the wind had turned cold, and the first drops had begun to fall. He started paying attention to the chalk after that, not obsessively. He wasn't a superstitious man. He had lived on the frontier long enough to know that weather came whether you predicted it or not, and the only sensible response was to be prepared regardless. But there was a difference between a person who guessed at weather from experience and a person who seemed to know it the way you know the layout of your own house in the dark. Isara's notes were always brief, always accurate. She wrote about the horses too. Which ones were sore, which ones were tired, which one had been favouring a leg, before Tobias had noticed the slight change in gait himself. She wrote about the soil near the south field, and how it was holding too much moisture from an underground source that needed redirecting before the root crops drowned. He spent an afternoon digging and found exactly what she described. He began to leave chalk near every door. She filled the margins of the house with small observations: temperature, animal moods, the direction of certain birds. Once she wrote only the word "wait" near the fence post near the northern pasture. He waited 2 days before understanding why. A sinkhole opened in that section of fence after a week of rain. If he had ridden through at speed, he might have lost a horse, or worse. He was beginning to understand that her silence was not an absence. It was a different kind of presence. On the evening she saved him from the lightning, he stood for a long time watching the burning tree behind the stable. The fire was small and controllable, caught fast before the wind could carry it. The horses had been moved in time. The damage was limited to scorched bark and a section of fencing easily replaced. He stood there longer than necessary. She stood beside him, not watching the fire, watching him. as if the fire was the least interesting thing happening in that moment, and what mattered was something she could see in the way his jaw had gone tight and his shoulders hadn't come down yet. He glanced at her sideways. She turned back toward the house without drama, set the kettle on the stove, sliced the remaining bread from the morning. By the time he came inside, his hands had stopped shaking, which he hadn't realized until they were steady again. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, going back through the weeks since she had come to the ranch. The mare recovering, the storm predicted, the sinkhole avoided, the birth of the calf she had prepared for before he'd noticed anything wrong with the cow. He was not a man who missed things on his own land. He had worked this ground for years and knew its patterns. She knew them faster. He thought about the fair, about the rope, about Brogar calling her broken. He thought about a man who had something extraordinary in front of him and called it useless because he couldn't understand it, because it didn't behave the way he expected, because its value didn't come packaged in a form he recognized. He pressed his hand against the ceiling of the dark room above his bed and felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't let move in a long time. In the morning, he found a new message on the kitchen chalkboard. Restless night. The land is fine. You will be too. He read it twice, then set the coffee on and didn't say anything about it. But the tightness in his shoulders was gone before the sun cleared the ridge. He thought that was probably what she intended. The rumors reached Grey Hollow faster than Tobias expected. He heard the first ones from a grain merchant during a supply run. A casual comment dropped into the transaction like a stone into still water. Something about the orc girl at the Mercer Ranch. Something about animals obeying her like dogs obey a whistle. The merchant laughed as if it were a harmless observation, and Tobias paid for his grain and said nothing. But he paid attention on the way home. He passed two groups of men on the road between the market and his land. Both conversations stopped as he rode through, not aggressively. The frontier was full of small silences around things people hadn't yet decided how to feel about. He knew the shape of those pauses. That evening, Isara was at the south fence when he returned. She was crouching near the post where she had noticed the sinkhole months before, pressing her palm flat against the dry earth. He watched her for a moment before tying the horse. She rose without hurrying, brushed the dust from her hands, and walked back toward the house ahead of him. He noticed she was walking differently than she had in the weeks before, less upright, her arms slightly pulled in, her head angled down. The way a person learns to take up less space when they start feeling too visible. He didn't know how to address it without words. His sign language was still limited, built from a few months of learning and mostly filled with gaps. He could say safe and home and stay. He could ask if she was cold or tired. He did not yet know the signs for I've heard what they're saying, and I don't believe any of it. He wrote it instead. Left the paper on the kitchen table that evening after dinner, short and plain. Whatever they're saying in town, it isn't true. This is your home. She read it while he was pretending to sharpen a tool near the window. He watched her from the corner of his eye, saw her read it twice, fold it carefully along its crease, and tuck it into the pocket of her work apron. She didn't write anything back that night. But when he came down before dawn the next morning, the coffee was already made, and there was fresh bread cooling on the rack, and the fire was burning exactly right, and he understood that was her answer. The boy's recovery changed things in town. The son of a farmhand who lived 3 miles north had fallen badly ill in the night, far too sick for home remedies, and the nearest doctor a half-day's ride in poor weather. Izara had been in the yard when the father came past on his horse, wild-eyed and shouting. She had gone inside, come back with a cloth bundle, and walked with Tobias to the man's home. He hadn't asked her. She had simply come. She worked for hours, quietly, precisely. Herbs from the bundle, water kept at a specific temperature. A poultice she built from things she found in the man's own kitchen that he hadn't known could be combined that way. By morning, the boy's fever had broken. By the following morning, he was sitting up asking for food. The father wept, and Tobias accepted the thanks on her behalf because she simply stood nearby and watched the boy eat with an expression that didn't need translation. Relief so complete it had almost no shape, but by the time they returned to the ranch, the story had already begun to change in the retelling. The town added details that weren't there, took away the herbs and the knowledge and the long, careful hours, and replaced them with something easier and more frightening, something that didn't require understanding. Tobias heard the word used for the first time at the end of that week, spoken by a woman in the dry goods store who didn't know he was standing behind the rack of rope and leather straps. Witch. He walked out without buying what he came for. That night he sat at the table for a long time after Isara had gone to bed. The chalk on the board near the door read, "Tomorrow will be cold, but clear." He looked at it and thought about everything that word could cost them. They came on a Tuesday, which was the kind of specific detail Tobias would always remember afterward. Not a dark night, not dramatic weather. Just a Tuesday afternoon, with flat grey cloud cover and a cold wind out of the north, and the smell of coming frost on the air. He was replacing a hinge on the stable door when he heard the horses on the road. 4 men, 2 human, 2 orc. He knew most of them by face, if not by close acquaintance. Border workers, farm hands, the kind of men who didn't usually travel together, which told him this wasn't about any particular grievance any one of them carried. This was about an idea they had all agreed on separately and then organized into a group. He set down the hinge and walked to meet them before they reached the main gate. The one who spoke first was named Harvel. A man named Tom stood just behind him, arms crossed, not meeting anyone's eyes. Harvel had a sun-weathered face and the slightly apologetic posture of someone who knew they were doing something they couldn't quite justify, but had committed to anyway. "Mercer." He nodded. "We've come about the orc girl. She has a name. People in town are worried." Tobias looked at the other 3. He recognized the shape of their discomfort. It wasn't anger. Not really. It was fear wearing anger's clothes, which was almost always more dangerous because it believed itself righteous. "She hasn't done anything to anyone," he said. "The Calloway boy. Recovered. Fully. That's not—" Harvel stopped. Started again. "No one knows what she did. No one can explain it. And before that, the lightning that hit your stable, and the sinkhole near the north pasture, and—" "All things she helped me avoid," Tobias said, "not cause. People are scared, Mercer." "Nee, people are ignorant," he said, and then immediately regretted the word because it made Harvel's jaw tighten and the 2 men behind him shift their weight forward. He softened his voice, not his position. "She reads the land. She reads the weather. She understands animals. That's not magic, that's attention. Most of us just stopped paying it." "She's not normal," said one of the men in the back. Tobias looked at him for a long moment. "Neither am I," he said. "Neither are you. Neither is anyone out here who's lasted more than a winter." The conversation moved in circles after that. He let it. He didn't raise his voice again. He didn't step back from the gate. He simply stood there and answered every concern with a fact until the arguments ran out of room to breathe, and what was left was just the cold and the wind and 4 men who didn't have quite enough certainty in what they were doing to push it further. What he didn't say was what he knew would have mattered most. He didn't say that he had spent years being alone in a way that felt permanent, that he had stopped expecting to feel at home in his own house, that somewhere in the past months the silence had changed from empty to full, and he didn't know how to explain what that was worth. He didn't say that she was the only person who had ever understood what he was feeling before he said it, before he even knew it himself. He just stood at the gate until they turned their horses around and left. That night Isara was waiting in the kitchen. She must have watched from the window. She had made tea and set 2 cups on the table. She sat down across from him, and when he looked at her, she reached across and put her hand over his and held it for a moment. He thought about everything he didn't know how to sign yet. Then he turned his hand over and held hers back. The boy's name was Eli. He was 7 years old, and he had been helping his mother gather wood at the edge of the tree line when he simply wasn't there anymore. The family waited an hour before realizing he hadn't come back on his own. They waited another before admitting to themselves what that meant. By the time the search had organized itself, the sky was already the color of old iron and the temperature was falling fast. Tobias joined the group at the road junction. He counted 12 men and 2 dogs, and a rising panic that everyone was trying to keep flattened beneath practical conversation about grid patterns and trail coverage. Isara had come with him. He hadn't asked. She had put on her coat and her boots, while he was still reading the note the neighbor had left, and by the time he was at the door, she was already beside it. The dogs hadn't found anything useful. The trails leading toward the forest broke into too many directions, and the recent frost had made tracking difficult. The men spread out with the particular grim efficiency of people doing something they were afraid wouldn't be enough. Tobias watched Isara. She didn't follow the group. She stood at the edge of the road near the tree line, facing the forest. She was very still, not frozen, not hesitant. Still the way a tuning fork is still before it's struck, like something inside her was listening for a frequency no one else had thought to find. She crouched down slowly. She placed both palms flat against the earth. He had seen her do this before, in smaller ways, near the sinkhole and near the stable in the nights before the roof came down in the storm. He had never been able to explain it and had stopped trying. He just knew the shape of what it looked like when she was receiving something. A few of the men nearby exchanged glances. One shook his head. She stood and began walking north along the tree line, not quite into the forest. Moving steadily, not fast, her eyes scanning the ground at intervals in a pattern he didn't fully understand. She turned east at a place where 2 old birch trees stood close together. Tobias followed without discussion. After a moment he heard footsteps behind him, 3, then 4 more of the search party coming along, whether from trust or from having run out of better options, he couldn't say. The forest was darker under the canopy, the frost-brittle undergrowth crunching softly underfoot. Isara picked her way through it with her eyes moving constantly. Broken branches, disturbed ground, the small signs that a frightened child leaves when they're moving through a place without knowing where they're going. She stopped at a cluster of fallen timber. A long dead oak had collapsed against a younger birch and formed a low shelter. She moved to the gap at the base and crouched down. The boy was inside. He was curled into himself with his jacket pulled around his knees and his face pressed against his arms. He was shaking hard, and when Tobias reached past Isara and touched his shoulder, the child made a sound that was mostly relief and partly fear and wholly exhausted. Tobias wrapped his coat around him without thinking. Someone from the back of the group lit a signal lantern. The men around them made sounds that weren't quite words. Tobias looked at Isara. She was watching the boy with an expression that was too quiet for triumph, too warm for indifference. She simply looked at him with the steadiness she brought to everything, as if finding him was never really a question, just a matter of listening to the right things long enough. He would think about that look for years afterward. After Eli came home, the temperature in Grey Hollow changed. Not the air temperature, the other kind. The slow, interior weather of a community deciding what it believes about something it doesn't understand. The first sign was Tom Weaver's shoulder. He showed up at the ranch gate 3 days after the rescue without announcement, his left arm held at the careful angle of a man managing significant pain. He had a clean, polite manner and the slightly sheepish expression of someone arriving at a place they'd previously helped make uncomfortable. "I know I said things," he told Tobias at the gate. "I know," Tobias said. A silence. "The doctor's in Milford until spring." Tobias opened the gate. Isara examined the shoulder the way she examined everything, with a careful, unhurried attention that seemed to cover more ground than it should. She found the injury using pressure and angle, and something that might have been intuition, or might have been an understanding of the body, so complete it only looked like intuition from the outside. She built a compress from dried material she kept in a wooden box on the kitchen shelf. She showed Tom how to apply it and wrote the intervals on a strip of paper she folded and pressed into his hand. He thanked her awkwardly. She nodded once. He was back at the gate a week later, this time with a jar of preserves and an expression that had lost most of the shame and kept all of the gratitude. The shoulder moved freely. He demonstrated by lifting his arm above his head. Tobias watched Isara look at this with the same stillness she brought to everything, and understood that his protection of her had never really been the point. She didn't need protection from the town's opinion. She needed time. Time for the town to encounter itself and decide what kind of place it wanted to be. After Tom came others. Quietly, without announcement. A woman who had not slept soundly in months. A child who wouldn't come out from under the bed and didn't know how to say why. A man whose horse had developed a lameness that 2 farriers had failed to diagnose. They came with small offerings, jars and bundles and firewood left at the post, and they left lighter than they arrived. The chalk notes near the door became part of the town's rhythm. People began timing their mornings around the walk past the ranch gate. Wind from the west, good day for market travel. Hard frost by nightfall. Bring your animals in. The fear had not entirely left, but it had learned to sit next to something else, something closer to gratitude. On the morning after the first true snowfall of winter, Tobias found Isara at the kitchen table, doing something he had not seen her do before. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, and her eyes closed, and her lips moving. Not speaking. Making the shape of sounds without the sounds themselves. Testing something in her mouth, the way a person tests the depth of water before stepping in. He stood in the doorway and didn't move. She opened her eyes and saw him. A pause. Something shifted in her expression, a decision being made at a level below calculation. He waited. She looked at him for a long time. The early light came through the frost-edged window and caught the amber of her eyes. The stove was warm. The house smelled of wood and coffee and the particular quiet of snow-covered ground. Then she turned back to the window and let the almost sound go back to silence. But she was smiling. And Tobias understood, without needing any of it explained, that something was growing in her that she was almost ready to let become real. He sat down across the table and poured the coffee. The evening she finally spoke, the sky was the color of embers. They had been sitting behind the house in the place they had claimed without discussion over the past year, the flat stone near the old oak where the western view opened up across 3 miles of quiet land. He had his harmonica. She had her tea. The cold was gentle and the last of the daylight was doing what it always did out here, spreading across the plains in long, unhurried strokes, like it had no particular place to be. He had been playing something slow. A melody without a name that had come to him over the winter the way melodies sometimes do, assembled out of the moods of certain mornings. She had her eyes closed. She often did when he played, and he had come to understand that she heard it differently than he made it. Not the notes, the resonance, the way sound changes the air before it disappears. He let the last note go and sat in the silence after it. She opened her eyes. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that had been building a long time. Not urgency. Something quieter and more permanent than urgency. The kind of recognition you only reach after you've stopped trying to name it. Her lips moved. He waited. "I don't need sound," she said. Her voice was low and slightly uneven, shaped by a mouth that had spent years building words only on paper and in air that no one was supposed to hear. The words came slowly, with the careful weight of something chosen with great precision. "I don't need sound," she said again. "To live." He set the harmonica down on the stone beside him. "I know," he said. She looked at the horizon. The last orange light was pulling back from the fields, the way a tide pulls back slowly, reluctantly, leaving the land darker and cooler, but no less itself. "I heard everything," she said. "Always." The weight of those two words landed somewhere between them and settled there. He thought about the fare, the rope, the word broken, spoken by a man who had never looked closely enough to see what he had. He thought about all the chalk notes, the shoulder in the night, the boy under the fallen tree, the winter mornings with coffee already made, the coat she had sewn from old cloth to keep him warm, the way she had put her hand over his that night after the men came to the gate and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. He thought about how long they had both been alone and what it had cost them to stop. "I know," he said again. "I always knew." That wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough for this moment, and she seemed to understand that too, the way she understood most things, by what was underneath rather than what was literal. She leaned her shoulder against his very slightly. He did not move away. The sun finished its work across the fields. The sky deepened into the dark blue that comes before stars. Around them, the ranch settled into its evening sounds, horses shifting in the stable, wind moving through the dry grass at the field's edge, somewhere far off the low sound of the land just breathing. Isara wrapped her hands around her cup. He picked up the harmonica again and played something softer than before. She closed her eyes. He watched the side of her face in the gathering dark, the steady calm of it, the way the cold air moved her hair slightly without disturbing anything underneath. This was the life, he thought. Not the dramatic version. Not the version with clean conclusions and answers to everything. Just this. Two people on a flat stone, behind a house at the end of a working day. One of them listening with their skin, and the other finally learning to be still enough to deserve that. The first stars came out. She didn't open her eyes, and he didn't stop playing, and the fields around them held everything quietly, the way good land holds what's given to it, without conditions, without asking for more than what's already there. The last note drifted out across the dark earth and dissolved. Neither of them spoke again. There was nothing left to say, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, that silence was not loneliness wearing a familiar face. It was something entirely different, something that took years and distance and a length of rope, cut by a small knife on a hot afternoon, to finally become what it had always been trying to be. It was home. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.